I'm pregnant with the CEO's baby. Can you just divorce him quickly? The woman who spoke to me was a 22-year-old just out of college. She deliberately entwined herself around the CEO's arm, looking at me with a smirk that only made me sigh. My husband, always busy with work, rarely came home, claiming he was out on business. Little did the employees know, it wasn't for them, he was using that time to have an affair. I felt so sorry for them. Seeing that I remained silent, the college student wore a triumphant smile. Well, it must be a shock, huh? Losing a husband who makes $1 million a year. But it's not your fault. After all, there's a huge age gap between me and you. Naturally, he'd choose me over you. Now that I'm going to be a celebrity wife, you better live within your means. I was furious with her who kept telling me like that, but something else caught my attention. $1 million a year? Whose story is that? She looked at me puzzled. From her manner, it seemed she believed my husband made $1 million a year. That's not true, is it? I looked at my husband, whose complexion had clearly changed. I could imagine the kind of explanation he had given her, and with the biggest smile, I turned to her. You know what? That person is actually. I'm Camila, 50 years old. I met Dan, my husband of the same age, through a friend's introduction and got married. After our marriage, we started a company together. Despite the hardships, we supported each other and have grown it to a point where we now employ a good number of people. Busy with work and having married late, we don't have children, but we live fulfilling days nonetheless. However, as expected with age, I've started to feel more tired and achy, but I continue to work. I could say the same for my husband. If I could see his hard work and dedication for the company, I could at least offer him some kind words of appreciation. But I felt none of that from him. Even today, coming home and immediately lying on the sofa to watch TV and laze around was enough to irritate me. Whenever he's home, all he does is complain about this ache or that pain. It's because you have less work than me, you should listen to me, he'd say. Hey, get me a beer. And so it begins again. Why don't you get it yourself? I'm preparing for tomorrow's meeting. With an exaggerated sigh, my husband opened the fridge. Really, does someone here not know how to pamper their husband? A wife is supposed to support her husband, right? If you just listen to me, you might actually be charming. In the beginning, without children, we could spend more on ourselves, dine at upscale restaurants, and even indulge in what felt like youthful dating, dreaming of a harmonious life together. Bringing work home and flaunting how much you're relied on at the company, it's like you're showing off. You're the reason the work never ends. And so he would complain, irritating me before heading off to bed early, leading a selfish life. Lately, it's been clear he's not putting his heart into his work. He might act as if he's dedicated, saying no one cares about the company more than he does, but it's all talk. When it's just him and his colleagues, his arrogance shows, often burdening them with menial tasks based on preference rather than ability. The colleagues didn't complain. And who could they turn to? My husband, spouting his daily grandiose speeches as the company's representative. There's no one to talk to about this. If we don't address these internal issues, it's only a matter of time before our employees break down. If I intervene, he'd retort that it's not my department, or that's his case to handle, but I can't just stand by. I didn't want to bring work issues home, but the only time I could catch him was after dinner. While cleaning up after dinner, I broached the subject. Aren't you being a bit harsh on your colleagues lately? What are you talking about? He replied, not taking his eyes off the TV. It looks like you're just offloading your work onto them. He sighed heavily. The company's performance is starting to decline, and here I am trying to contribute by starting a new venture, and this is the thanks I get. He mumbled sarcastically. New venture? What are you talking about? I haven't heard anything about that. It's because you and the other employees aren't doing anything that I have to step in. I'm not just dumping work on my colleagues. I'm asking for their help because there's not enough time to work on new projects due to that. Dan said without even looking at me. It's really annoying to hear complaints about being mean to colleagues or dumping work on them, especially from someone who cares about the company as much as I do. It seems he really didn't like being cautioned by me. What you're doing is just dumping responsibilities. Do you think the colleagues can simply refuse when you ask? If you're asking for help, are you doing anything to cover their workload? If not, you're just increasing their work for no reason. They can't keep up with that. Yeah, I got it. You're such a nag. Dan muttered in annoyance and went to his room. After that, there's no sign of him actually working, just coming to the office, causing frustration not just for me but for the employees as well. When I made time to confront him about this within the company, he would work seriously for about an hour. But then, he would just start fiddling with his phone again, not looking serious at all. The employees probably have a lot they want to say, but with me being his wife, it's hard for them to speak up. I had no choice but to keep cautioning Dan and try to cover for the colleagues myself. Seeing this, Dan seemed to take us lightly, showing no signs of intending to improve. We had promised to decide on the company's direction together. Yet, he keeps mentioning new projects that I've never heard about. If the performance is deteriorating, we should be identifying the cause and figuring out a countermeasure. Despite my efforts in this area, the company's performance isn't recovering because Dan keeps meddling on his own. He doesn't listen when I say it's too risky to engage in new projects without being able to recover the costs with our current financial power, insisting on not interfering with what he's doing and stopping all conversations. Lately, he's been coming home late. When I mention, "You're home late," he responds grumpily, "I was meeting with a client." But this happens too frequently. When asked which client, he answers, but it seems he's also visiting places with women, not just for meals. He keeps saying to write it off as expenses, but it's impossible to do so for vague expenses where it's unclear who he was with and for what project. Even when pressed, he just says it's for the future or for a key client, without giving any concrete names. Moreover, he argues, as long as there's a receipt, it should be fine. One day, while on a sales visit, I saw Dan at a cafe. Maybe he was organizing documents? No, knowing him. He probably used the excuse of being out on sales visits to slack off again. As I approached the cafe, I saw another shadow at his table by the window. It seemed he was sharing a table with someone. Upon closer inspection, it was a woman, and quite a young one at that. I didn't recognize her, and she certainly wasn't one of our employees or someone from a company we deal with. At this time, and during work hours, who could she be? Could she be a client as Dan says? She didn't seem like someone who'd frequent bars, and it's doubtful at her age she'd be handling any deals. But then, it's wrong to judge capability by appearance or age. Lately, I've been too harsh on Dan. Aware that I'm starting to suspect him of infidelity even. But perhaps Dan is trying to change the company in his own way. I thought it might be time to have a serious talk with him for the first time in a while. Maybe there are things he couldn't consult with me because of my attitude. I left for the next sales visit. Later, at dinner with Dan, I brought it up. By the way, I heard you were out on sales visits today. Was it about the new project? Something like that. He replied, seemingly uninterested. I saw you at the cafe at lunch. Was that woman a client? Are you spying on me? His voice turned sour, and he stopped eating. Spying? What are you talking about? I just thought I should greet her if she's a client. Is there a set day she'll visit us? Or is there something shady you're worried about being seen? Dan glared at me. What's this about being guilty? I was interviewing that girl for the new project. Interview? I haven't heard anything about that. It was last minute. I didn't need to tell you every little thing. Who is she? An employee? Part-time? What employment conditions did you tell her? Why do I have to explain every little detail to you? If you think there's something fishy, then keep thinking that. I don't have time for such nonsense. HR decisions aren't yours alone to make, right? We have enough staff, and with the budget being tight, we decided no new hires this year. Flipping that decision on your own, she must be pretty special, huh? I at least want to know who she is. Dan stood up from his chair, clearly annoyed and unwilling to even glance at me. Are you actually cheating on me? Despite my long-held silence, Dan said nothing and headed to his room. A few days later, at the morning assembly, Dan mentioned that there was a visitor interested in touring the company. Opening the door with a big smile, there stood the young woman I saw at the cafe that day. This girl just graduated from college. I hope you all make her feel welcome. Dan introduced her. Looking around, the employees all seemed puzzled, looking back at me as if they expected I knew about her visit. I, for one, hadn't been informed about any tour, let alone her suddenly showing up at the company. I approached them. Excuse me, your name was? Michelle. Michelle, thank you for coming. Due to a miscommunication with our staff, I wasn't aware of your visit, and it's difficult for us to accommodate you today. Would it be alright if we contact you to reschedule? I'm sorry for coming suddenly, Michelle said, hiding behind Dan. She clutched the hem of Dan's jacket, looking like she was being scolded without having done anything wrong. Dan told her not to worry and sent her home, then sat at his desk looking irritable. Can we talk for a moment? I called Dan into the meeting room to confront him about Michelle. Seriously, bringing someone for a tour without consulting anyone is troubling. What were you thinking? What's it to you? You were all smiles with Michelle, and now you're lecturing me? It's just a company tour, no need to make a fuss. Just a tour? What if she shared any of the information she saw here? We have a lot of client information. If there's going to be a tour, I'd like to make sure sensitive stuff isn't visible, and to have a guide. Despite my pursuit of his lack of crisis management, Dan was unfazed. He left the meeting room with a cool demeanor, calling Michelle affectionately. Seeing how close he was with her and how protective he seemed, I became more suspicious that Dan was having an affair with Michelle. Later, when I asked Dan what happened to the girl who visited the company, he said she had graduated from college but wouldn't say more, telling me to drop the subject. The big talk about new projects ceased after Michelle's visit, probably just an excuse to meet her. Now that things were going well with Michelle, maybe the company didn't matter to him anymore. I couldn't understand why he brought her to the company if they could have just met outside. Just saying he was out on sales visits would have been enough without using the new project as an excuse. Bringing her to the company made all the employees aware of Michelle. I was lost on what Dan wanted to achieve. Lately, Dan has been leaving work on time, earlier than anyone else, and not coming home, sometimes staying out overnight. On the rare occasion he was home, he watched TV and drink, visibly annoyed when I arrived. You're home early. Yeah. Finished work early too, Dan responded, sounding bothered. Shower. With that, he went to the bathroom. His cell phone was on the table. Not paying it much mind, I was sorting through groceries when it rang. The caller ID showed Michelle. After it rang out and then started again, Dan came out of the bathroom, snatched up the phone, and glared at me. Don't touch my phone. Ever heard of privacy, you shameless woman? With that, he stormed off to his room. From Dan's room, I could hear him laughing loudly, talking to Michelle about how annoying I was and how he wished to leave me for her. Caught off guard by this evidence of infidelity, I wondered what to do next. After a brief pause, I knocked on my husband's door. I'd like to talk with Michelle, too. Let's all meet, I suggested to him. He seemed delighted, still on the phone, and started coordinating a schedule with Michelle. After he hung up, he said with satisfaction, I've decided to divorce you and marry Michelle. Nothing you say can change that. Then, Michelle arrived at our house this weekend, looking triumphant. She glanced around the house with a smirk. So this was your love nest, huh? Well, it used to be, she said as if our divorce was already decided. I had her sit at the table and served her coffee. Immediately, my husband brought the divorce papers from the room and told me to sign. Michelle looked at me with a face full of triumph, as if she had been chosen by my husband and I was being discarded. "Hey. Hurry up and sign the divorce papers," she taunted. Disgusted with both of them, I signed the papers. From that day, my husband stopped coming home. It wasn't long before Michelle called. "We got married," she announced out of the blue. "I'm pregnant with Dan's baby. I'm his wife now." She laughed vulgarly over the phone. "You're so upset you can't even speak, huh? Well, of course. After divorcing a husband with $1 million income, your future looks pretty bleak. Poor ex-CEO's wife, it's so sad I could cry. Should I give you some charity? It must be for the money. Otherwise, why would such a young woman, who's neither particularly talented nor good-looking, approach my husband?" He was completely taken in by the attention of a younger woman. But Michelle was mistaken. "Oh dear, the one with $1 million income is me, the CEO. He was just the CEO's husband and a board member, so he acted all high and mighty. But now that we're divorcing, he'll be removed from the board. So, don't expect to live the celebrity wife life. Better brace yourself." Michelle fell silent immediately after I said that. And then shouted back after a moment. "What? That's a lie. I won't forgive you, you old hag." She hung up. Soon after, my husband called. "What did you say to Michelle?" It seemed Michelle had confronted him about it. "I just told her the truth that I'm the CEO. And that now you're not a board member, your income will plummet, and you won't be able to afford the lifestyle. Just a heads up." My husband's anger flared even more at my response, but I found it satisfying. It's his fault for lying in the first place. "I'll be seeking alimony from you," I said and hung up. The next day, my husband and Michelle stormed into the office. Still furious. They barged in without a care for the employees' stares, Michelle standing in front of me. "From now on, my husband will be the CEO. You need to leave." They thought by ousting me and making her husband CEO, they could secure the $1 million income for themselves. My husband followed up with bravado, "Even without you, all the employees will follow me. After all, I'm more capable and more popular than you." Despite his bold claims, the employees, who had only been polite to him because he was the CEO's husband and did nothing but slack off, gave him cold looks. Why would anyone want to follow him as the company leader under those circumstances? Unaware of the employees' cold stares, my husband continued to rage at me, and Michelle, getting even more carried away, kept yelling, "Just hand over the company to my husband already." I thought I was finally free of them after the divorce, but they were still clinging on. Knowing they wouldn't understand no matter what I said, but as CEO, I had a duty to protect the company and its employees. "Calm down, both of you. It's unseemly for adults to be screaming like this. And Michelle, you were the one who mistakenly thought your husband was the CEO." Michelle approached me even more aggressively. "Yeah, well, that doesn't matter. All you have to do is hand over the company." She wouldn't listen to reason. As she seemed about to lunge at me, an employee stepped in between us. "Enough. If you don't stop this ruckus, I'm calling the police." Led by this employee, others stepped in between Michelle and me. "We won't let you do anything to our CEO. Get out, you're a nuisance." Pressed by the employee's fierce attitudes, Michelle backed off. My husband, surprised by the sudden shift in the employee's demeanor towards him, stood there dumbfounded. They had all been enduring just because of him. If I had just said that's the kind of husband he is and given up on resolving the issue, I wouldn't have so many people on my side now. "What, all of you, stay away from me. I'm the CEO's wife. I'll have all of you fired. You know, you can't just change the CEO overnight. And even if you became the CEO's wife, that doesn't mean you get to control personnel decisions." Despite my words, Michelle kept on screaming. In contrast, Dan stood there, dumbfounded. Apparently, being looked down on by the employees was taking its toll. Or maybe he was overwhelmed by Michelle, who was berating me with filthy language. Michelle, gasping for breath from her tirade, must have realized she wouldn't get the future she had imagined. Ignoring the dazed Dan, she stormed out of the office. Dan, snapping out of it, looked at me, but when I gestured towards the door, he hurried out after Michelle. After kicking out these troublesome individuals, I went around and apologized to each employee. Afterwards, Dan and Michelle's relationship deteriorated. Dan insisted they wouldn't divorce because they had a child, while Michelle demanded a divorce. It seems they started fighting because Michelle found out I was the CEO. They both said whatever they wanted, even considering suing each other. Honestly, whatever mess they got into was none of my business. I just demanded compensation from him. The idea that what they did to me could just be forgotten was ludicrous. Soon after, I demanded compensation, but they both lashed out at me, overwhelmed with their own problems. Demanded compensation at a time like this? It's all your fault to begin with. You're to blame, Dan rambled, but it sounded like nothing more than the howling of a defeated dog. After I had a lawyer contact him, Dan quickly paid the compensation. For all his bluster towards me, he became meek as soon as a lawyer got involved. What a small man. Dan and Michelle fought over whether to divorce for a long time, but in the end, they did divorce. And then, the story takes a rather silly turn. It turns out that Michelle's child wasn't Dan's. Based on the timing of her pregnancy, she was already pregnant before meeting Dan, and the real father was unknown. Michelle had planned to claim the child was Dan's to get a divorce and demand child support. Upon learning this, Dan and Michelle's situation got even messier. One would think Dan could have figured this out with a bit of thought, but he seemed to have never doubted that the child was his. Michelle had hoped to at least get child support from Dan, but since the child wasn't his and they hadn't been married long, it was a no-go. Michelle had no choice but to return to her strict parents' house, where, after hearing about everything, they said, "Leave the child and get out. Never cross our threshold again." Crying, Michelle begged her parents, "Please let me stay. I'll change," and they reluctantly agreed, keeping the child but making it clear her trust was far from restored. But it seems Michelle's trust is unlikely to be regained, and she is being re-educated from scratch. Despite the possibility of being disowned, Michelle has returned to her parents' home, citing her child as the reason, and is now receiving help with raising the child. Considering what she had done to me, it seemed like a mild punishment. However, leaving Michelle to her own devices could lead to more outrageous actions in the future. She doesn't seem to know the meaning of remorse. Perhaps living with her strict parents forever might actually be for the best. Although her character is unlikely to change, leading to a difficult life ahead. Well, serve her right. Blinded by greed, she approached Dan, thinking she could lead an easy life, but look where that got her. After the divorce, Dan moved into a new condo with Michelle, but they couldn't afford the rent on the upscale place they chose. Dan had spent a lot on Michelle during their affair, trying to appear wealthy with expensive clothes and cars. But it turns out he was borrowing heavily from financial companies at high interest rates, leading to even more debt. Struggling with debt repayment and unable to quit his job, Dan, who could barely do menial tasks, became a nuisance at the company, and the atmosphere around him only worsened. Unable to stand it, he eventually resigned. Losing his home, job, wife, and everything else, I heard Dan was seen living on the streets. I couldn't help but laugh out loud. Opening a beer can in the now peaceful home without Dan. I enjoyed my free time. Imagining Dan living on the streets, I laughed again. Serves him right. With savings, a thriving company, and no financial worries, getting compensation from Dan was just icing on the cake. Thinking about how I was considering staying with that kind of husband makes me shudder. I finished my beer and went to bed. The exhaustion and aches I had felt before seemed to have softened. Now, without the stress from when my husband was here, both the employees and I can work more freely and happily. Afterward, with the support and trust of my team, we launched a new venture. Now, the company has grown even larger, and I find every day fulfilling.